I didn't know how my friends would react. I certainly didn't know how work would react. I was still hesitant to let a lot of the outside world in on this secret.
Hey there, I'm Julie. Welcome to Uncomfy, a podcast about sticking with moments that challenge us. We share the stories of real people in moments that challenge their perspective. And instead of getting angry or shutting down, they stuck with the discomfort. They stayed curious and open, and they're glad they did. We hope these stories inspire you to stick with it too, because there is so much to gain. New empathy, deeper relationships, more clarity about our own views. I'm glad you're here. Now, let's get uncomfy. Here's a story about saying a terrifying truth out loud for the very first time. I'm joined by Erik DaRosa. He's a mental health advocate, speaker, co-author of the book Scars to Stars, where he shares a bit of his personal experience. And he's co-host of a podcast called From Survivor to Thriver. The goal of the show is to normalize discussions around mental health topics and remind people that they're not alone, that there's strength in community, and, as they like to say, it's perfectly okay to not always be okay. Erik, welcome. It is so great to have you here today.
Thank you so much, Julie. I'm really excited and honored to be on the show today.
Let's dive straight into your stick with it story. Set up the moment for us. What background do we need to know heading into this moment where you had to choose to get uncomfortable or stay uncomfortable?
Sure. So the moment was I was 33 years old. And the setup for that, I grew up living with severe anxiety, obsessive-compulsive disorder, and I was later diagnosed with PTSD. And with that came some terrifying, intrusive thoughts. So growing up and all the way into the beginning of my professional career in New York City, I kept this a secret. I never told anybody. I thought for the longest time I was the only one. I thought I was broken. I thought I was unfixable. And I was terrified. I thought this was how I was going to have to live the rest of my life. And it would ebb and flow, just like with any other mental health issue. There are times when I'd actually feel really good. There were also long periods of time when I wouldn't feel so great. And as I wrote in the book, in the late summer of 2004, it all came to a head. Sometime late in August, I had just started a new job in New York City when I suffered my first of two dissociative episodes where your brain goes into kind of, let's call it shutdown mode to protect itself. So I was, at the time, I was in the car, and during that time period, about 20 minutes into the drive, I actually forgot where I was. I forgot how to get home. And I felt incredibly unsafe. And so I pulled the car over. My wife started driving. And then I describe it as though somebody just turned the lights out. The world really went black on me. And about an hour and a half later, I came to. I was back in New York City. I had no recollection at all of that time period.
And so what happened next? I mean, what did you do at this point? You say you've been struggling with your mental health for a period of time here, but you were also at the same time sort of living a successful life, right? I mean, you were in New York City. So what were you doing in the finance world, or what was it that was happening there?
So yeah, I spent 18 years in the finance world in New York. And for the first, from the age of 21 until the age of 33, I was working on Wall Street. I was a derivatives trader. And so you can just imagine somebody suffering with severe anxiety going to work every day in that environment, which is incredibly stressful. And on the outside, I had it all together, right? I had, this perfect facade of somebody who was, a quote unquote successful New York City banker, while on the inside, I was a mess. But I didn't want anybody to ever see that. I was terrified if anybody would ever see who that person on the inside really was. And so when that weekend happened, I realized I couldn't live like that any longer. And so the decision was made, along with my wife, that it was time for me to seek help and professional help. And so that moment for me was about a week later when I finally sat down across from a complete stranger who I will refer to as Dr. K, an amazing older man, just incredibly caring, incredibly thoughtful, who saw in me something that I had never seen in myself. That although I had all this pain and all this turmoil, I was in fact fixable and I wasn't broken.
So thank you for sharing such a personal and vulnerable story. I see this then as the stick with it moment that we can identify where, you obviously had this crisis and were like, I need to get some help, but then the choice to actually start talking about it, like you had never actually expressed what you were experiencing,
No,
the pain
not
that
at
you
all.
were in
Not at all.
to anyone. Like this was the decision to have the conversation. Must have been deeply uncomfortable. What did it feel like? Even though you were sitting face to face with that's how therapy works, right? Like this is a professional. And yet, what were some of the things going through your mind, your heart, as you tried to get the words out about what you were experiencing?
It's such a great question, Julie. And as I reflect on it now, I can see myself that day. His office was on the Upper West Side, about 20 blocks away from my apartment. I scheduled it for 7 a.m. I didn't want anybody at work to know. And so going in that morning, I remember in my mind thinking through all of the things that I thought I couldn't tell him. And I thought, well, I can't tell him this, I can't tell him that. And I thought to myself, if I allow some of these intrusive thoughts, at the time, I didn't know what intrusive thoughts were, but if I allow these intrusive thoughts to come out of my mouth to another human being, there's probably a pretty high risk of him calling the New York City Police Department and the police showing up and putting me in handcuffs and taking me away. That's how terrified and scared I was of actually verbalizing with somebody the thoughts that were going on in my own head. And I can remember just telling him some of the most terrifying, horrifying, intrusive thoughts that were in my mind. And I can still see him just looking at me and nodding and saying, uh-huh. And I would ask him on occasion, have you ever heard anything this crazy? I'm using air quotes for crazy. And he would just look at me and smile and he'd be like, yeah, it's nothing I haven't heard before. And the more I heard that, the more I started to realize maybe I'm not the only person out there who's experiencing this. It was just his very calming nature and my ability to start to slowly unpack things and give him little nuggets that helped him lead me on this trail of healing. And something that, let's call it a month earlier, I never, if somebody had said it to me, I never would have thought would have happened.
So how did finally being willing to talk, even in the safety of a therapist's office, sort of change the trajectory, change the way you started to think about who you could talk to about mental health? I have to note the fact that you now host this podcast. You've written your story in a book that anyone could go out and buy and read. You're telling it in a lot of places. Are you, was that just sort of like an immediate, I need to talk to more people, or did it sort of still take some time to cross over into the threshold of having conversations with coworkers or whatever?
No, it took quite a while. So okay. 2004, 2005, I decided that I was my own best doctor. So I took myself off my medication. I stopped seeing my therapist. And hence in 2006, I had another dissociative episode. And that's when I looked in the mirror and said, okay, all of these things you're doing are not things you can like pick and choose. And it's something that you need to continue to do for the rest of your life. And so I was doing therapy. I was taking medication. I stepped on snow for the first time and started skiing, something that would change the trajectory of my life forever. And I really, other than my wife, I really never started to share it with anybody until we were getting ready to leave New York City in the spring of 2011 and move here to Colorado. And then I started to open up to some of my friends. I was still hesitant to let a lot of the outside world in on this secret. I didn't know how my friends would react. I certainly didn't know how work would react. And I never shared that with them. I left and moved here, and it wasn't until, as you said, I started my podcast, I wrote my story, I started sharing my story, that a lot of people in my pre-Colorado circle then learned about my story. So it definitely took me some time. It took me some time to get comfortable. And then each time I started to tell a piece of my story, I realized that not only was I not alone, but I was finding there were pieces of my story that were resonating with other people. And they started to open up to me. And that was the big aha moment. And that's when I realized that what I had gone through, what I had experienced, it really happened for me, didn't happen to me. And it happened for me so that I could help to be a voice for others who were not yet comfortable being able to share their own personal stories.
So what's your advice then, Erik DaRosa, just finally for people who are like, yeah, that would be great. I mean, I know I'm sure that talking about it could do me some good, but I'm worried about who to pick, and are they going to have the same kind of positive reaction, and how much do I share? What's your advice to folks when they're trying to figure out how to start getting uncomfortable in that way about, in that vulnerability about their own mental health struggles?
It's a great question. Find somebody who you trust. It can be a family member, a loved one, a spouse, a partner, a friend. It can be picking up the phone if you're in crisis and dialing 988. Make that conversation happen. It's going to feel, as you said, extremely uncomfortable. The very first time you utter those words, whatever those words may be, when you share with somebody that you're not doing okay. At the same time that it feels incredibly uncomfortable, it'll feel as though this tremendous weight has been lifted off of your shoulders. And from that day on, it gets a little bit easier. And the more you open up and you share and the more vulnerable you become, the easier it becomes to get uncomfortable and the stronger you become as a person. And by you sharing and being vulnerable, it allows so many other people to be vulnerable right back. And that's how we build this community, and that's how we shatter the stigma.
Erik DaRosa is a mental health advocate, speaker. He's written his story in a book he co-authored called Scars to Stars, and co-host of the podcast From Survivor to Thriver. Plus, you're doing a lot of fun stuff from the ski slopes and from the mountain bike slopes on your social media too. So where can people find you, Erik?
Sure. So people can find me. Our website is called FromSurvivorToThriver.com. The podcast is called From Survivor to Thriver. All the links are available through our website. And I'm excited to announce I am launching a mental health ski program called U-Most, which stands for Unlocking Minds on Snow Together. And they're going to begin in the winter of 2024-25 here in Aspen, Colorado. And so I'm taking everything that I've learned as an instructor and as somebody who healed through the sport of skiing, and I'm taking it 360 degrees to help other people recognize how being out in the mountain environment can be so incredibly healing, and getting to share your story and be around other like-minded people.
Yeah. Sounds awesome. Erik, thank you so much for sharing your Stick With It story today on Uncomfy. It's been great having you.
Thank you so much, Julie. It was a pleasure.
And thank you for getting uncomfy with us today. I would love to hear about a stick with it moment you've had recently. What was the perspective or situation that challenged you? Why did you choose to stick with the discomfort rather than bail out or get defensive? And how did it go? Drop a line to uncomfy@byu.edu. And if you're interested in more insights on mental health challenges facing men and boys in America, we actually did a whole episode about that on my other podcast. It's called Top of Mind. Each episode tackles one tough topic in a way that will challenge you to consider new perspectives, and it might even be a little uncomfortable. You can find Top of Mind on Spotify, YouTube, and Apple. Uncomfy is a BYU radio podcast. Samuel Benson produces it, and the team includes Enrique Prado, James Hoops, and Sam Payne. Our theme music was composed by Kelsey Ney. I'm Julie Rose. Can't wait to get uncomfy with you again next week. It's Julie. Hey, one quick thing to mention to you. I would love to recommend a podcast called In Good Faith. It's from the BYU Radio family of podcasts. It's hosted by Stephen Cat Perry. And this show is all about connecting with believers from various religions. On Uncomfy, we're looking to have hard conversations, and it doesn't get harder than talking about religion when you have different traditions and beliefs. And this podcast is just so cool because Stephen talks with people about their own personal faith journeys, people from all walks of life, Christians, Buddhists, Jews, Muslims, many, many more. And it's a chance to hear their stories in their own words. And I always come away with a deeper understanding both of their faith and of my own faith in listening to these conversations. Plus, Stephen's just a really well-traveled guy, so his unique global perspective adds this really great richness to every conversation. So check out In Good Faith. You can listen on all the podcast apps, and I'd love to hear what you think about it.